Everything has been covered already, so I'll just be talking about the meta-legal principles and the way we can possibly think differently. Now, I've written a paper, well, I wrote it many, many years ago. It was published by Birmingham University on the notion of ensoulment and the prohibition or the regulation of abortion, in which we talk about the distinction of life, spirit, and soul. We talk about, the paper talks about ensoulment as the emergence of the human soul. Ruh is the spirit, nafs is the soul, and hayat is life. It might be worth reading that paper to bring in clarity from the hadith literature as to when this emergence of the human soul occurs. The emergence is of the human soul in that paper, not of the spirit. Spirit is something else. It might give some lead into it. Now, the problem that we are having within our jurisprudential thinking is caused by two fundamental elements that are assumed within our minds. One is that Islam has devastated the discussion on the identity of a Muslim for all eternity and on Islamic regulations to the extent that whatever the Prophet has said stands today. This assumption in itself needs to be dissected, understood. Islam did not give anything original when it came to what we call broadly muamalat, or interactions, human intercourse, transactions. Islam fundamentally and in an original fashion only gave the Muslim identity in terms of its spiritual teachings. As far as every other aspect of life was concerned, Islam in itself appeared within a given context. It merely tweaked and modified those things to make them less abusive, more egalitarian, and more productive. If we were to say that Islam, with finality, has given the regulations in all walks of life, as is the naive assumption, then we ought to say today that slavery in principle is permissible. Decapitation of limbs is absolutely the norm in justice. Nobody would agree to that. We would still say marital rape is allowed. What is considered marital rape today? We would still say a relationship with a 2-year-old girl, which the fatwas allow that a man can marry a 2-year-old girl, this pedophilic relationship would be allowed. What we are saying here is that no, Islam did not give anything fundamentally in terms of what we call muamalat broadly, which includes everything other than spiritual instructions, what are the ibadat, notions of decency and consumables. Everything other than that is known as muamalat. So that is the first assumption that needs to be checked. So today when the whole notion arises about death, what is death? Islam does not have any contribution in that, in an original fashion or fundamental fashion. The A'immah Salamullah alayhim ajmain have given phenomenal insights into what contributes death, but they could only give as much as the context allowed them. In a hadith, there was people had died through lightning, and Imam Rada Salamullah alayhi said, wait for 3 days. Don't bury them, wait for 3 days. They might just regain consciousness, and we were then looking at a study that people are presumed dead, but their brains are still functioning and then they regain consciousness. So the Imam said, as a precaution, wait for 3 days. But the Imam could only say that when an event like that unfolded. Without a context, the Imam is unable to contribute. And how much will the Prophet and the Imam contribute? They only contributed in their own context. So Islamic teachings do not fundamentally give us a sense of death. What is death? You figure it out. So that's the first thing. As far as the muamalat are concerned, Islam does not, in a decisive manner, contribute to the notion of muamalat. These are things that are fluctuating. We are beings that are always moving, learning through experiences. It's a process of trial and error. We try things out and then we tweak them and try them once more and better ourselves. You cannot give anything finality in such an evolving system, because what is true today will be wrong tomorrow. Now the other problem that comes is that, well, we need to get things accurate. The principle of certainty. There is no certainty at all. In an evolutionary scheme, there is no epistemic finality. There is no epistemic certainty. It's a flawed principle. And that is why the jurists call themselves the fallibilists. Mukhattiya. In fallibilism, we are right until proven wrong. And we admit that within our assumption of being right, we may be wrong. Now here, what we say is that the problem that the jurist has is that they look at the apparentness of the text. And they want to secure the apparent meaning, because the apparent meaning forms a safety net. What we are saying here is that that is true within the context in which the apparent statement was given. The statements were given in 7th century Arabia. In that era, in that context, that apparent meaning worked in accordance with where they were. Take it out of its context of time and space, and the apparent meaning becomes obsolete. So there is no principle of certitude or certainty. Things are always moving on. Now you might say, well, in that case, we might be killing somebody. We will say, think about it this way. So many people have died before us, before we could understand how we lengthen life. A lot of those people were buried while still potentially being alive. This is the pragmatic nature of life. That's the way we are. There are 7 billion people. You can't go around saving everybody indefinitely. And Mahdi just presented that if we can free somebody's brain, then we can resuscitate, revive it, and the rest of the body can be grown, or maybe the brain can be implanted. Then that does the sanctity of life and the law of the sanctity of life force us, therefore, to preserve every brain for a futuristic revival. I was in a situation in Birmingham. I'd just come back from presenting a paper on euthanasia in Iran. They called me into the hospital. There was an 18-year-old child, and she was on extraordinary life support systems. And the doctors were saying, we are going to remove them. And obviously the parents were beside themselves, so they called me in. So I said, look, we have a principle of sanctity of life. So the doctor said to me, what do you want me to do? He said, we are giving her the maximum treatment we can. She could be suffering. Let her die in dignity. I said, well, look, this notion of dignity and suffering. He said, look, keep your philosophy to yourself. Look at her. Look at her state. And I said, you're right. He said, do you want me to physically put my hand inside her chest and then physically pump her heart? Because that's the next thing you will say for me to do. There has to be a cutoff point somewhere. There has to be a cutoff point somewhere. We know that if we take her heart out and keep it pumping, then it'll still pump. But is that what we are expected to do? I said, give me 2 hours, let me think over it. It was the most difficult decision of my life, but she died within 2 hours, which was a huge mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that she went, because had we allowed for the removal of the life support system, the mother would have lived with the guilt that if she had been allowed to live, God might have revived her. And had we kept her alive and suffering, then everybody would have to live with the guilt that we unnecessarily prolonged her suffering, for example. This is the nature of human existence. We can never be flawless. There is no principle of certainty. There is a principle of fallibility. There's no infallibilism. There is a principle of fallibility. We are fallible. Now, if you look at all these distinctions of the Muslim and the non-Muslim and the sacredness of a Muslim over a non-Muslim, we will see that they are derived from verses like وَلَنْ يَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ لِلْكَافِرِينَ لِلْمُسْلِمِينَ سَبِيلًا. Allah has not made any sabil for the kafir over a Muslim. And therefore extracting the organs of a Muslim and putting it into kafir, there's a notion of a sabil. Or Islam يَعْلُو وَلَا يُعْلَى عَلَيْهِ, the statement of the Prophet that Islam predominates. But these texts of the Prophet and the Quran are interpreted within a context. The context is a biased context, the land of the Muslim and the land of other than the Muslim. Now you can see how this paradigm has influenced a jurist and their thinking. So for example, Sayyid Khomeini and Sayyid Khoury, they both say that within a non-Muslim country, it is unlawful to refer to the law courts of the non-Muslims to retrieve your right. Sayyid al-Khoury says it's haram, but if you retrieve it, it's yours. Sayyid Khomeini said, even if you retrieve it, it's not yours. Because Sultan al-Jair is not a sultan at all. But what we are saying is that at that time, the paradigm was that these are Muslims, And these are lands antagonistic to Islam. But now we have nation states. The world is no longer divided on the lines of religion. We are all making contract in the country in which we are. And surely the verse of the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud, be truthful to the aqd, would be the one that's prevalent now in the given paradigm in which we are. Because we all have equal rights. We are same, and there's reciprocity. And again, as Madhya discussed, the whole notion of mutilation. This is an altruistic act. This is not mutilation at all. Mutilation is with the notion of undignifying the body. Who can say to me, if I were to give one of my kidneys to a grand marja, that this is me mutilating my body? This is an altruistic act. It's a sacrifice I'm doing. You see how we can play around with these notions and these terms? What appears to me is when I look at all these debates is that, look, the jurists have made up their minds at one point in history as to what is Islam and what is other than Islam, what are rights. Then we are forced into a new context. We haven't had the time to think around our understanding within the new context. All that we have was developed in the original context. So we will apply that to the new context with its own justifications. So we will go and find justifications to apply what we already know within the newer context. Whereas the ideal situation ought to be that, look, we don't have a precedence. This is a new context. We have to rethink it. Now, the jurist is in no way able to respond to these questions on his own or on their own. They have a role to play, but they can't define death, and medical science will get it wrong. Within 10 years, we will find that we are redefining death, and brain death is not death at all. We will know this, that brain death is not death at all, and we can revive them. But for now, at a pragmatic level, it is death. And that is how Islam has operated. It's been very pragmatic. The Quranic law that get 2 men or 1 man and 2 women was based on the pragmatic nature of the Quran. There is no infallibility of 2 men. 2 men can be wrong. And indeed they are wrong for majority of the time. But that was the only way the Quran could do it. So there's a full principle of fallibility. And there is a pragmatic principle that we have to make do with what we have at present with our understanding. We cannot take precautions today because after 10 years things will change. Today we have to act in accordance with the demand of the time. Now, for the Muslims, life becomes easier. As I said, the jurist is in no way capable on their own or on his own to deliberate upon these things satisfactorily. You need philosophers, you need theosophers, you need medics and medical science. You need a whole host of people, whole host of knowledge and intellects and expertise to be integrated together. And without that, we won't have satisfactory responses. And in addition, whatever response we give today will have no finality. Will be seen to be wrong by tomorrow, but nonetheless, it will be a vital step that we take today for a better tomorrow, and that's the way life has been all along. Now, there are 1 or 2 more things, and I'm finished my 15 minutes, but there are 1 or 2 more things that these notions that we have in Islam, the notions of sacredness, the notion of X, Y, and Z, these are not to be given that much importance. Because in Islam, we understand, of course, we are hardwired to live. And we want to live for 1,000 years. And we want to live for 1,000,000 years, and we should do that. This is how God has hardwired us. يَوَدُّ أَحَدُهُمْ لَوْ يُعَمَّرْ أَلْفَ سَنَةٍ. Yes? وَمَا هُوَ بِمُزَحْزَحِهِ مِنَ الْعَذَابِ أَنْ يُعَمَّرْ. Every one of them wants to live for 1,000 years. It's good to live for 1,000 years, but that will not free them from death eventually. Allah says adab, but I'm talking about in our case death. Yes? The Muslims should also understand the principle of death leading in to the next life. And in fact, if we were to scrutinize the ahadith of visiting the graves for a certain number of days, we will understand that the person inside the grave is still alive in a way of life. In a future world, it will be very possible to dig open these graves and restore these people. Because there's some form of life still there. Yes? Even the ziyarah that we say, the Ahlul Qubur, we address them, yes? In a future world, it might even be possible to extract some DNA and reconstruct the whole being with the same identity. I mean, the fact that Isa could resurrect the dead from the grave says something, doesn't it? That person was dead and he's still alive, he's in a state of death, life, living, who knows? Yes? So one of the things that Madhya raised was that, no, death truly never comes. Death truly never comes. There has been, at a pragmatic level, you have to assume that this is death, end of story, even if it's not death. For all practical reason, this is what we understand death to be, and let's go with it. In that we will make mistakes. We will bury many people who are alive, and we'll confine them to their graves. I'll just finish with one point. In Dar es Salaam, when we went to the graveyard, the person sitting in the graveyard said, I get very frightened. I said, why? He said, because at night I hear screams and shouts. I said, do you know what? These are poor people that you have buried prematurely, who have woken up in their grave and are trying to frantically come out, and you think they are ghosts. Go and dig them out. No, I'm not joking. I'm not joking at all. People have been presumed dead and they haven't died. Do you really think ghosts scream and shout? Have you ever heard a ghost scream and shout? In graveyard is the most peaceful place. Yes? Those poor people have been buried prematurely. Because in Dar es Salaam, you die in the morning, in the next hour your ghusl is done, you're in your grave. And that's why the Imams used to say, wait. At times they used to say, wait for 3 days. Why? Because there's a real possibility. So now we're talking here in a fallibilistic system. We will always be wrong. But at least, even if people inside their grave are alive, that sort of life in which they have apparent discretion like me and you have is not there. We consider that as death and brain death. Therefore, I think this is something that we are converging to in this era right now, and I think that would be most plausible to accept. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.